Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for your patience as we get started here. So I'm Christina Jones. I'm the education librarian at Indiana University on the Bloomington campus. And so I'm so glad to be speaking with you today. Julie, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks for having us here. I'm Julie Lorah. So I'm at Indiana University as an assistant professor in the School of Education, and I teach statistics classes. And so that's actually technically not true. I'm actually moving to Clemson. So technically I'm in between affiliations, but I'm going to be at Clemson University in the fall also teaching statistics classes.
Thanks. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. It looks like I'm able to do that. Okay, and so we are going to talk to you about a really fruitful collaboration that we just sort of wrapped up in the spring semester, in which we investigate, we kind of lead statistics education students through the process of investigating authority and promoting social justice in statistics. And so I'll let Julie talk a little bit about why there's a need for this social justice lens in statistics education in particular.
Great, thank you. So I've been teaching statistics since I started at IU in 2015. I have some intro and more advanced classes. I teach graduate students in the School of Education. And in those classes and in my experience as a student, the sort of social justice perspective is kind of lacking. And so there's a lot of work now in trying to integrate that into teaching practice. But in my experience, maybe a little bit less information, or I had trouble finding information about how to do so in my statistics classes. And I really wanted to give the students a chance to step back and think more broadly about how their work is impacted by the way statistics methods were developed, different ways that they're used, and just these intersections. So that was something I was really trying to do. And so I reached out to Christina and Ethan from libraries to help me think about curating and finding and sharing and displaying these type of resources. So that was kind of the first sort of spark for these different collaborations, which moved also into the field of information literacy and has kind of continued the social justice perspective throughout.
And I'll add that when Julie first approached the libraries, it was in response to a 21 book challenge that the IU libraries issued during the months and days after the death of George Floyd, in which people were trying to educate themselves and to immerse themselves in information. So this was also in response to a library reading challenge and resource challenge. And she thought rightly that would be a really kind of interesting lens for statistics education. So that's sort of how this was born. So then I'll talk a little bit about the role of the library in this endeavor. The first thing I want to talk about is a really a nice opportunity that the IU Libraries offers once or twice a year to faculty across the campus, and that is an information literacy course grant. And so these grants support the work of course instructors to work with librarians to kind of tinker and retool their assignments, maybe the trajectory of their class, particularly their research journey in the class, both undergraduate and graduate students, to embed aspects of information literacy throughout the course, and particularly in a course assignment. And so Julie and Ethan and I applied for this course grant. And what I found personally, just as a practitioner, that this type of opportunity to work with a subject expert is so fruitful, because I learned quite a bit about statistics and statistics education, things that I didn't really know about. And then Julie and her students were happily surprised at the resources that were available to them from the IU libraries. And so it ended up being a really nice partnership. So I appreciate this opportunity just as a practitioner to work with the myriad experts like Julie on our campus to help kind of be the best of both worlds in this collaboration. So if you want to know more about our course grants, I included it here in the slide deck. So the first thing that I did was, not being an expert in statistics education, but I am an expert in curating. So I took the guide that the IU libraries put together for the 21 reading challenge and kind of tweaked it to be related to statistics education and social justice and statistics education. And so we'll look at just a minute at this. So sorry about that. There we go. And so I came up with this this LibGuide, good old LibGuide here, and we featured this excellent excellent data visualization from W.E.B. Du Bois from that book. And Ethan, you're the one that recommended this book as a nice kind of anchoring image for our guide. And so what we did was we looked through the library catalog and we culled articles that were related to social justice and statistics and investigating and interrogating the directions and the foundations of these data sets and looking critically at them as a way to bring community together among statisticians and statistics faculty to use these resources and to kind of populate their syllabus and their courses with this type of information. And so, so we just kind of pulled together a big bibliography and we we labeled them according to like the history, so it's some background, contemporary issues, and then ways of moving forward. We also included a data set and mapping tools to lead people to quality data resources, and I think Ethan's going to talk about that in a little bit. So that's where we got started. And then another important aspect of this particular guide is the ability for other scholars and experts to contribute. And so we're hoping as we get our wheels under us and more comfortable talking about this and sharing it and sort of disseminating this information, that we can continue to build this resource and add important works, monographs, and articles alike. Okay. And so once we got the kind of curated resources together, we got the reading list together, then it was time to go dig into Julie's course and do some embedded lectures and resources that were specific to Julie's I'm sorry, I say the name of it again.
Yeah, so I taught a multi-level modeling course, which is a 600 level course. It's maybe the third or further along class that the students may have taken in their graduate training.
And so I was the first librarian. It was I was going to enter into the course early on to discuss information literacy and how that can be applied to their work in Julie's class. And so I really kind of focused particularly on the aspect of authority because most of the work that we were going to be doing was to investigate how the data was collected, how it was produced and reported, and the uses of the data. And so all of that seemed to tie in really nicely with the frame related to authority. In particular, with the knowledge practices that I was hoping to focus upon was the use of research tools, library resources to do this investigation, to look at the impact of the particular data set, to look at the impact of the producer, to investigate the funding, if that might impact the way in which the data was collected or produced or represented. So I thought that was a really kind of a nice way to integrate library resources, is to use them as a tool to investigate. And then a bigger sort of aspect that sort of haunted this whole this whole endeavor for me personally is that, and we would talk about this often during our collaboration, was the idea that people regard data as absolute, as something that's sort of impersonal, it's unbiased, the numbers don't lie. And so often, especially if you don't come from a statistics background, it's easy to be intimidated by statistics. And so it's a bit of a third rail. And as a result, it was not easy to find a lot of library literature in particular about this idea of investigating authority with data and reporters. And so I was also kind of hoping to kind of break a little ground there to help information literacy professionals, but also students of statistics education that may not go to be a scholar and a faculty member, but just to be able to feel empowered to use these critical skills related to authority. And so as a result, with the students' disposition, I was hoping, again, I kind of teased these out of the framework, to have an open mind and to not blindly accept the numbers as they're presented or reported, and to motivate them to find these authoritative resources. And Ethan did a great job of helping us curate that, and to develop sort of a skeptical stance when reporters are using data, and to have the tools. So I thought that the authority in particular was germane to the sort of work that we were hoping to do in Julie's class. So as a result, I like to use LibGuides as kind of to center the discussion. And so I added on a page to the resource guide that I showed you early on to Julie's class course site, which then I just embedded into Canvas. And so I just kind of briefly touched upon authority here, and then I did a longer discussion. And then I introduced some guiding questions. So there were questions that were related to the source itself. Talking about, was it an individual? Are they affiliated with an organization? Could that affiliation affect the producer, or could it affect the collection of that work? Why was the data collected in the first place? What was the intention? Is the data source different from the reporter or the citer? So is someone repackaging it? Are they using the data to further their particular point of view or stated need? If it's repackaged, can you find the source? And then we talked a little bit more about investigating the impact. So first, we were leading students to investigate who's producing it, but then how big of an impact did this data have upon research and scholarship? So we'll look at mostly citations. How often is it cited? Is the data used in research? How does it compare with if they were doing their own statistics gathering, how it would compare? And then another one that was kind of an interesting line of thought when we were looking and investigating the data sets that they were using in the class is whether or not their peers have objections to the data, or to the measure, or to the producer. And so then since the students in Julie's class were using different data sets, I encouraged them to use their data and to use the tools, some of these library tools that I'm sure that you all have as well in your peer institutions, to discover the impact both in a selective way and then in a broader scope. And then using GuideStar Pro and the GAO and the Better Business Bureau, if for an open source sort of tool to investigate the organizations and the agencies. So a little bit later on, we'll have some time to work through this process. I think it might make a little more sense and might be more fun to do this. So a little bit later on, we'll walk you through the process that we had the students do to investigate the authority of their particular data set. And now I'll turn it over to Ethan so he can talk about his part.
Yep. I'll introduce myself too, because sorry, while I work with data and do statistical methods, apparently I can't figure out how to work Zoom rooms. So I was just sitting in the lobby waiting to be manually transferred over, but I didn't realize I had to select the room. Yeah, so I'm Ethan Fridmanski. I'm the data librarian at IU. I came to the position with a lot of kind of statistical and data focused research experience. So that's kind of like the perspective I bring to it. And on the project, I helped kind of focus on identifying good data sources in addition to helping with the bibliography. Because I think, we've been talking a lot about statistics, but I think when, we're talking about justice oriented like quantitative methods in general, right? I think there's two components, right? There's the statistical side and the data side. And while they're not wholly disconnected, I think it's sometimes useful to think about them separately. At the end of the day though, and this goes for the statistics side too, right? There's not like data sets created out there for the purpose of doing like justice focused analysis, right? I think the goal is to find just good data that follows good statistical and quantitative fundamentals, right? Knowing about your sample sizes, right? Knowing about if the people who collected the data were upfront about the whole process. And I think, this touches on a lot of what Christina was talking about. So I think sometimes when I feel like when I was thinking through this whole idea, it was difficult for me to draw a link because I was trying to find like, oh, well, this data set is perfect for exploring these types of questions. But, ultimately at the end of the day, it's about finding good data that follows good fundamentals, right? And then the justice side comes with your framing and your research questions. Yeah, so some of the things I think we've talked about a lot were, and Christina's covered this too, right? Bias in the way the data was collected, right? Or the methods that were used with the data set, right? Also incentives, financial incentives that may be at work when people were collecting the data set, right? And something we didn't explore it in too depth, but I think one of our last meetings, we talked about some of the, it'd be interesting to explore the history of some of these statistical methodologies and how they're rooted in right and sometimes genocide. And I know like a lot of the statistical methods come out of Nazi Germany, I believe. I can't remember, but there's like a lot of history behind these statistical methods too, and I think that side of it is going to be worth exploring more in the future. So next slide, Christina. Yeah, so in a little bit, I'll just talk a little bit about finding data, because that's kind of what my lecture was about. Right, again, when you're looking for data set, you always want to incorporate that information literacy, right, and kind of like that general data literacy. But I find, especially lately when I'm teaching and doing talks like this in classrooms, one of the hardest part about finding data is that it's kind of overwhelming, right? And just finding data takes its own set of skills. So I think if we want to create more justice focused research, right, we need to make sure more people have the ability to find data and know where to get it. Otherwise, it kind of is like censoring certain segments of the research population just because not everyone has the same set of skills to find these resources. And talking in Julie's class, I find that a lot of students and faculty don't know about library. So I'm talking just a little bit about some good places to go for data when you don't know. Maybe a patron comes to you asking for help with this and you don't really know where to start. A lot of people don't know about library resources, like the databases we subscribe to. I've only been in libraries for a year now, but I still find that I'm learning about all the resources we offer every day. Like there's a lot of good economic data because there's a lot of data out there that isn't open, right? you have to subscribe to it, and the library can help get access to that the data that's kind of behind those financial barriers. There's also a lot of good open data resources, and I like to talk about ICPSR is a good one-stop shop for a wide variety of disciplines. And they do a good job of curating, making sure the data has documentation. So if there are problems with it, right, you at least know what the problems are. Harvard Dataverse does this to some extent. The quality can vary. But at the end of the day, if a data set doesn't have documentation or a research article published with it, you should use that data more skeptically than one that's well documented and has a lot of information about it. Because what good is a data set if you don't even know what the variables are representing? Like maybe a data set just has variable names like variable 1, variable 2, variable 3, and no documentation to tell you what that means, right? Then that data you can't really use that. Right, so you just need to make sure you find data that can actually be used. And then lastly, just different resources like Pew Research Center and different places that have publicly available data that comes from, right? I mean, they produce a wide variety of survey data in covering a lot of different topics. The last thing I like to tell people, and this is something I've been using more in my research recently, in the sense that I am writing a paper right now that comes from a data set I found out about in a research publication. And I think sometimes students don't necessarily think of this as the first place to go. But if you're doing research in a really specific subfield, see what data sets other people are using, right? And then go for there. I think, because when I give talks like these in classrooms, I kind of like go through my process, and I use the example of my most recent paper that I was working on. And it kind of connects point 1 and point 3 here. I found a data set being used in an article. I looked it up and I found that we were subscribed to it through the library. That's just a good, easy way to get access to data in your field. And yeah, that's the end of this slide. Thanks, Christina. And again, sorry for showing it up a couple minutes late.
That's good. Thank you, Ethan. I appreciate that. So Julie, would you please talk about the course assignment that you created?
Yeah. So the lectures came first, right? So we had the 2 guest lectures, and then in order to connect this back to the students' work and kind of their final project work and their overall work in the class, I created an assignment for them, which had 2 components. There was a written paper and an in-class presentation. It's my first time doing it, so I kept it pretty free form, where I gave them some prompts, which I've kind of copied in the slide here, so you can take a look at those. But the basic idea was that they could choose one of these prompts or choose on their own a way to connect their work, these concepts that we talked about regarding information literacy and social justice, and then the classwork. Their final project was using a real data set, doing a multi-level model. So most of them were able to connect that in some way to these concepts. And so we had a lot of interesting discussions. The students did seem to enjoy this a lot, in that they were really engaged. The discussions, people seemed engaged during the in-class discussions. And I told them, like, it's pretty casual, just maybe 5 minutes, but we spent quite a bit longer than that. So as just one example, some of the students were working with this data set, examining video game use in Korea, and it was related to legislation around allowable use in adolescents and things like that. The data set that they were using, though, was I think it was funded actually by the video game industry. So we talked about, okay, that's really an interesting concept related to, authority and this data set and what that means. And we had a lot of different discussions like that. So overall, I think it really went well. I did get in the anonymous feedback, one of the students said that, oh, we spent way too long on this, and we were, I'd rather have course content and not talk about this and whatnot. And so I think overall the feedback was very positive. There's a little bit of mixed feedback, which I think just comes from the idea that this isn't something students are used to seeing in their statistics classes. So, they're maybe viewing it with a little bit of a skepticism, like, oh, we're just having these conversations, but shouldn't we be like learning about this model and how to, interpret this result and, these hard facts and numbers and stuff like that. And so that's sort of expected. I also think that just being the first time, I think it was new to them in the sense that they had a little bit of difficulty focusing in. So our discussions were very like wandery and, which is okay, but I think that just speaks to the newness of it and the need for me as the instructor to really highly curate this, just because they're not sure what to do with it. So I think in terms of future directions, I definitely want to keep doing something like this. And I do like the presentations because that enables this dialogue and this conversation. In the future, I'm going to create a little bit more specific rubric and specific curation around the types of questions and get them a little bit more focused indirectly in these specific issues. But I do think it's overall helpful, and I think it can be integrated without really losing out on important class content. There's a ton of stuff that you could cover in any given statistics class. You can't cover it all. So, taking a little bit of that time and moving it in this way, I think was really productive.
Thank you. Oh, and I think you sort of, talked a little bit about this, but I do think it's interesting because I wasn't part of the class discussions. I was just a part of the lecture. That idea of a little bit of pushback from your students, and the idea that this hasn't really been present in their classes before. And I guess it would be, I guess I would add for a future direction to maybe have some more talks or a really good example of how if the authority of data isn't, investigated, how that could be harmful or that could harm others.
I think it also speaks to the need for this, because I feel like a lot of statistics education is kind of pragmatic for job skills or research skills or whatever. And having gone through grad school and switching from qualitative to quantitative methods, I feel like part of the draw for some students is like, oh, well, it's like job skills, you know what I mean? And it kind of lose sight, although, at the end of the day, this is integrally connected, because to do these types of research questions, you really do need statistics. It's just about making good use of those statistical fundamentals. Yeah.
So Julie, I'll let you talk about next steps.
Yeah, great. So this is really just the first step for us. We just started working together, last summer, and we're still really, defining the directions and the things we can do. But it seems like there's a lot. So we have a few specific next steps, but, you guys have ideas, or we're going to keep, noodling on this, because I think there's a lot that we can do and there's a lot that needs to be done. So the first thing, we have deeper dive into the history of statistical models. We mentioned that briefly when we introduced that the curated reading list and the LibGuide, but framing this more so that students can, or anyone who's using statistical models really, can get a better sense of the context and the use of how those models were developed and how that actually sort of impacts the way that you might think about interpreting it and the type of claims that you can make from given models. So, why are these the models we're using they were developed to make these type of claims, say about like agriculture, but now we're using them to make claims about people. And what does that mean, right? We should think about that. So this is the kind of thing that we want to investigate in terms of providing resources, but also thinking about the type of discussion questions, class integration, things like that. We also want to make this a really like a community resource in the sense that it's available, but also that we have that two-way communication where the community can offer ideas about what we might want to add to this list. that we could share, so that we're sort of having that dialogue rather than a one-way kind of thing. We also talked about developing an OER, which is new to me, but I'm really excited about learning about this type of resource. So the types of things that we're talking about here, just basically integrating social justice issues and the idea of authority as constructed into statistics education is something that we don't feel like there's really resources around, like specifically like, here's what you would do, here's how you do this, like here's, you know, discussion questions, here's reading or whatever. So we want to maybe create more of curated resource that is a little bit more comprehensive, just in the sense that it could, you know, you could one-stop shop kind of thing. Of course, there's always more to add, but that's sort of one of our goals. And then the last one, I'm hoping to next spring create just a 1-credit seminar for students, just any students who are interested, as well as us working on the project. And in the seminar, I want to give us the opportunity and the space to actually read it critically in depth, the resources that we have on the list. We haven't read every single word of every one, and also to consider new resources and read those in depth as well, so that we can continue to work on curating the list with the students and collaboratively. But we can also use this to start coming up with more specific discussion prompts and activities and guided lectures and teaching resources for instructors who want to do this. So like myself included, right? One of the things I mentioned is I really need to have a little bit more time and experience to really design that teaching activity and those discussion prompts in a way that's going to be most focused and useful to students. So this would be a good step in that direction. And those are the big things that we are thinking about now. And so I guess I'll pass it back to Christina for our next part of our talk.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now I thought it would be good for us to just kind of demonstrate what we did in the class and to give you an opportunity to try this out. So let's see here. I created a Jamboard. But before we do you have any questions or comments?
There isn't anything in the chat, so I think maybe people are still processing. And
Okay, so I created some Jamboards, and I think we'll just do this as a group. So Julie and Ethan, bear with me so we can try this together. So I put the link to the course guide in the chat to give you an idea of the resources that I pointed the students to, the tools to use to interrogate or to investigate the authority of the data sets. And bearing in mind that we're all at different institutions, I just was kind of hoping that you would log into your particular proxy server. And so I made this Jamboard. And so what I did for the discussion is I identified a data set that's typically used, especially in education statistics. And so, it's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And so we would use, I went to Google Scholar. And I looked at different articles and research that drew upon this particular data set. And then I looked at the impact, and we followed, I'm sorry, I'm a little over here. First, we looked at the producer of that particular data set. And Ethan, if you want to jump in on investigating that.
Yeah, so I think the first couple links are going to, when you're kind of doing this thing, the first couple links might be let's see, like research articles about the production of the data set, which could be useful too. I think when I did it, let's see. Oh yeah, that was the first article was the one I looked at. When I did it earlier, it showed up as just like the research articles about the NAP and its collection. So if you click on that, bring up the Jamboard. So just like thinking through some of these questions, right? Was the data collected by individual researchers or an organization, right? They're using the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So it wasn't collected by the individual researchers themselves. It was collected by an organization.
And so we use a green sticky note to look at observations. And so it was collected by an organization.
And just going down the list, right? Could an affiliation of the producer affect the work? Well, let's look at the abstract again. And we might not be able to get all this information right just from the abstract. Where I would look for this information would be if the journal or if the publisher requires it, right? Conflicts of interest that are usually found at the end of the article. Let me see. We'll just say for the sake of this example, right? Not that we can see, right? You know, we would want to investigate that more in a classroom setting.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next question, why was the data collected in the first place? This is a case where the data was collected I mean, if you really wanted to get this, I would read probably the white paper that's published with the most recent version or the original version of the NAEP, and that's where you would kind of get that information from. But we'll say for the sake of this, you know, the current context and being a presentation, right? It was created for the sake of measuring student outcomes. I'm not an expert with this data set, so I'm just using it as an example. Right, so the data was created with the intent to study student progress. Again, but this doesn't necessarily make it good or bad, right? I feel like to get at intent, you would really want to read the white paper of the data set originally, when it was originally published, or some of the documentation, or a lot of times like big data sets like this, they probably have their own website where they talk about some of the goals and missions of the data set. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to get at that, right? And then you can see, right, so the data was collected to measure student progress. But from this other information, maybe we see that, right, it was funded by an organization that's measures progress by, you know, job success, right? That would be something that could impact the survey, right? They were going to be focused on student progress and entry into the labor market, right? This is just me speculating, right? But this could be also be, right, measured with the intent to increase educational skills, right? It could be maybe focused on STEM or humanities or social sciences. Those are just the types of things you'll want to think about when assessing a data set. And, you know, not all the time are you going to be able to get that great of information. But I feel like in the cases with these larger data sets like NAEP, you should be able to get a pretty good idea from reading from the organization themselves and different white papers that were published with the data set. What was the next question, Christina?
So then we were going to investigate the impact. And this is where kind of Google Scholar is not as helpful, because I found that particularly with the social sciences using Scopus and then putting in the name of the data set, I was able to better demonstrate the impact of this particular data set within the scholarship. And so that was one that I led the students into looking at when they would investigate their data set. I directed them to Google Scholar, but it's a little harder to sort and get to that granular level of impact. So we used Scopus, and that's what I would recommend using there. We also had Web of Science, and then we talked about ICPSR as another way to investigate the impact of a particular data set. It's a little more selective. It isn't as comprehensive as Google Scholar, but you will see impact here as well. Yeah. So those are some of the tools that we use to help the students investigate their data set, to dig a little bit more deeply, and some of those guiding questions. Julie, do you want to add anything, or Ethan?
I'll just say, like, and that going back to the Jamboard, as just like an example of like a type of assignment you can use to get at or to develop these kind of like critical thinking skills in the context of data, right, and statistics, but specifically in this investigating the source, right? It's not like a linear process, right? It's like there's always going to be a back and forth where you're like, reading about the affiliation of the data producer, right? But then looking at their reasons for collecting the data, right? And you just kind of go back and forth and think about these things. And I think a lot of researchers do this already in our heads, just automatically, and it's not as straightforward to students. And I think especially right in environments where statistics may be looked at as a more practical skill to learn, right? I think it's important to reach students as early as possible and to talk about these things. So yeah.
At the undergraduate level?
Yeah, I mean, or or like their first stats class in grad school, right? I think these are topics that students should be talking about, because I didn't learn statistics till I started my PhD program. So not all students will have statistic knowledge in undergrad. But yeah, just making sure that these issues are talked about before we get old and set in our ways.
That set in for me for sure. All of this stretched me. Okay, so we had some questions for our participants, for you all, if you're still with us. How might this activity work in some of your information literacy courses, or have you thought about this? Has anyone tried this? Are there any tools that you would recommend that I didn't put on our research guide?
I'll just jump in and say, I personally don't teach. I'm the STEM librarian at my university. I don't teach a lot of statistics classes, but certainly going forward, I'll think more about framing using data in a different way after hearing the talks. I think it's a really interesting way to think about data as almost like you would a research article. You would also kind of think about it the same way before you use a data set or something like that. So I don't use any specific tools at the moment, but certainly going forward, I'll think more about that. And if anybody has any thoughts, they can unmute themselves and just jump in as well.
I appreciate what you said, Diana, about thinking like data, thinking thinking about data the same way we think about articles. And that's how I found my entree into this particular project, because I was intimidated by the subject. I didn't think that I was qualified until I thought, well, wait a minute, I know how to investigate authority. I know how to use library tools. So why couldn't I do this? And so once I just kind of sat a moment and looked at the frame, particularly the frame of authority, I was able to make these connections. And I think it's so critical now more than ever, because there's such a proliferation of reporting and journalism and news that uses data. It's just sort of, they throw the word data around and percentages around, and all of a sudden they seem authoritative. And I think particularly now it's important to talk about this, even if we're not experts yet. I think it's important to begin the conversation that numbers are numbers, that they are just numbers, and they can be used for good or for ill or for nefarious purposes or benevolent purposes, but to not be afraid to use the same tools that we use to, look at impact, look at authority in whatever way it's constructed in whatever discipline we're looking at. This is also going to be true of numbers and modeling and statistics. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Laura. Thank you for your for your vote of confidence. So the reason that I wanted to do, I even proposed to do this workshop for this particular conference is I am interested in conversation, and I think that Ethan and Julie, you are too, that we like to have these important conversations because we get more ideas. We can kind of lift each other up. We can show, have you thought of this resource? Have you thought about thinking of something in this way? So this project is very much, I think of, and I think maybe you'll agree, Ethan and Julie, that it's a conversation that we want to continue to grow, or even an awareness that we want to continue to grow. Yes. Yeah. So even in government statistics, how those are put together is not necessarily bias free. So looking at that, what is the government funding? Who are the people collecting? What's their affiliation? All of these are important questions to ask, even if it seems like, oh, the government is unbiased. Well, that's not necessarily true. Yeah.
And I think that, like what Christina was saying, you don't need 10 years of statistics education to be critical of data or statistics, right? A lot of it is rooted in just information literacy fundamentals. And I think data and statistics sometimes gets like shrouded in this mist of authority. Like, I don't even, not necessarily authority in the sense of individual people, but just in like, it represents like objective science or something, when it's subjected to the same biases that any sort of information is.
I see another question in the chat. Julie or Ethan, can you answer the question in the chat related to undergraduate nursing students?
I can read it out too, so everyone can. Oh, I think I just lost it. There it is. I support undergraduate nursing students and know that they need more engagement with information literacy approach to data analysis in their research methods course taken in their junior year. What level do you think is appropriate to delve in with undergrads who are not inherently strong in math?
I think, and Julie can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like with people who are not, don't have the strong statistical background, data visualization is a very accessible way to approach this. And I feel like in our day-to-day lives, like we're gonna, like if you're reading right, Washington Post, whatever, newspaper, right, you're going to be exposed to data visualizations probably more than tables or just raw numbers, or at the very least, the visualizations are going to be what stands out to you. So I think that is a good entryway, and you don't even need to know like a programming language to generate data visualizations. When I was teaching undergraduate statistics at my previous institution, a couple times, and the first time it was a little rocky, but the second time I did this activity, we did data visualizations by hand, and it was a little rough the first time I did it, but you know, by doing that, you know, you can literally make a data product with a small data set, and you don't have to have any experience with whatever programming language you use for your research analysis. So that would be one way.
Yeah, I like that question. I mostly work with graduate students, but I did do one kind of more of a seminar with undergrads. And I think that a lot of this is not necessarily tied to being strong in math or even having a strong background in statistics. It's more just bringing a critical perspective to it. And bringing, to me, honestly, I feel like my most important role as statistics instructor is confidence builder. I'm just there to be like, guys, you can do this. And then I show them how to do that and they do it. And then they're like, oh, I can do this. And that's like really the process that I'm trying to get across. And so it's really getting across this math anxiety barrier, and just bringing the critical perspective of, you know, they sometimes come in like, okay, numbers don't lie, right? And it's just sort of, you know, dismantling that perspective, which doesn't really require any knowledge of math, right? It's just a matter of thinking about, you know, our example that we sort of delved into was authority is constructed, but of course you can, you know, probably heard of this book, How to Lie with Statistics, right? Which is a tongue in cheek, but you know, what are the different, how is this, I don't know, we'll just say subjective for lack of a better word. And I think that can be something to bring in the very beginning, but also paired with that idea of starting to build confidence in the students, that you can learn this just like you can learn anything else. It's not magic. It's not, you don't have to be a special person to know this thing or something like that. And I think that goes a long way. So I don't know. I would add that as well.
And to add one more thing, to be honest, a lot of the experts don't know the math either. They're citing the math, right? And they're being trained to how to interpret models. And they don't necessarily recall the math on demand, right? Maybe they had covered it in their course in grad school, right? But at the end of the day, they are using a package and some sort of statistical software. And some people remember the math more than others. And not everyone who understands these models approach it from that level, right? They approach it from a much more subjective, interpretive lens, and we're trusting the people who do these or you know, when we're running models, we're trusting the people who did the math 50 years ago. So not everyone who's doing statistics is necessarily math people.
So Lisa, I'll just jump in and commiserate. And I did have a lot of anxiety at the very beginning. So if you get nothing else out of this presentation, is that if I can do it, you totally can do it. And I feel a lot better about it. Yeah, so I really appreciate everyone's attention and comments and questions. And I'm so glad that some of you found this useful. I'm really happy. I hope that I'll hear from you because I'd love for this project to grow.